And now cladding, as Grenfell survivors lodge a multi-million-pound lawsuit. We look at the upcoming amendment in the fire safety bill, which could prevent leaseholders in unsafe buildings from crippling bills. And we uncover figures which show there are still public and private buildings being built in London using some combustible materials. Aggie Chambra reports.
It's one thing having a baby. It's another thing having a baby in a global pandemic. And then to top it all off, you're living in a fire trap and no one seems to want to help you.
Rosie lives in a flat in Leighton, which in November she found out has similar cladding to that on Grenfell.
You buy a flat and you think that it's safe. You think it's got building regs done well, it's fire safety's been assessed, and then, less than 1 year in, you start to have problems, and then 4 years in, 3-4 years in, you discover that it's got Type 3 ACN cladding around it, which is, it's dangerous.
The building is under 18 metres, so removal won't be covered by the government's £1.6 billion Building Safety Fund. Rosie could now be facing costs of £20,000 and a doubling of her monthly service charge.
We won't be able to afford to pay double the service charge and pay our mortgage. So we're going to have to try and rent our place out and find something cheaper to rent. I feel like I've been a woman on the edge. I feel like I'm going to cry quite frequently. So I'm very lucky that I've got her to keep me going, because if I didn't have her, I don't think I'd be able to cope, to be honest.
Rosie's not alone. We've heard stories of bills up to £100,000, developers dissolving themselves to prevent liability, and 24-hour watches to police buildings for fires costing £1,000 per flat per month.
Steve backpacking.
But they, and the thousands of others in their positions, could be saved by an amendment tabled by Tory MP Stephen McPartland coming in the next few weeks.
We're campaigning for every leaseholder in the country that's affected by this problem, whether they're in a 1-storey, 2, 3, 5-storey flat, whether they're living on the ground floor or on floor 25. We're campaigning for every single leaseholder in the country that's being hit with these fire safety bills, because the mortgage companies, the management companies, the insurance companies, all these other companies, they don't care whether it's above or below 18 metres. The government's created the problem itself by moving the goalposts and confusing the issue. So, I mean, it's not fair, it's not acceptable, it's shocking, it's disgusting.
And if you were to have one message for your colleague, Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick, what would it be?
Stop talking and start doing.
Stephen may be successful in stopping historic remedial charges being passed on to leaseholders. But what about buildings being built now?
There is no full register for the number of buildings in the UK with combustible materials, but industry sources have estimated there could be 3,600 homes and 14 public building projects built in London or being built in London in the last 2 years with potentially combustible materials.
Using combustible material is now banned on residential buildings taller than 18 metres, but still permitted in these smaller homes and public buildings.
We feel there should be a building safety register, and once there is a building safety regulator in place, which is obviously the subject of the legislation we're expecting to go before Parliament later this year, hopefully there will be that kind of national register. But it's fundamentally needed.
And should people be building with totally non-combustible materials? Is that possible?
Difficult, because actually more or less everything is combustible to some degree, but obviously we should be building with materials which have the most limited combustibility possible for the circumstances that we're using, and we should be taking safety cases into account to make sure that we're building with the appropriate materials.
It's almost 4 years on from the Grenfell Tower fire, and people like Rosie and countless more still feel scared in their homes. So when will the lessons of the past be used to build a safe future for these families?
Well, Bob, you're one of the Conservative backbenchers who have signed Stephen McParland's amendment. Would you agree with what he said in the film there, that Robert Jenrick, the Housing Secretary, should talk less and do more?
Well, I think the first thing is, obviously, we all agree that leaseholders should not have to bear any costs with remediating this unsafe cladding. There's the ACM cladding, there's the non-ACM cladding. But one of the big problems here is that the tests applied to cladding are unfit. They're not fit for purpose. They need to be reformed. The regulations need to be reformed as well. And no one should be in a building which is in an unsafe fashion. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that the government need to extend the Building Safety Fund well into the next year and beyond. And what we do know, the estimates I've seen suggest that up to £5 billion is going to be required to do this. Now, in the case of socially rented accommodation, reasonable progress has been made over that, although we haven't completed all of it yet. But in the privately owned blocks, where freeholders and building owners have failed to do their work, I have a quite radical solution to that, and that is the government should take them over, remediate the cladding, and then set the leaseholders up in what we call common hold, so they will own the building going forward afterwards. Because if building owners have failed to do their job, then I'm afraid what we have to do is make sure the leaseholders, who are the innocent parties in all this, are protected.
Bob, it's not just cladding, though, is it? Because fire safety inspections on some blocks have found that actually some of the blocks are structurally unsound, lacking features like fire breaks. So who compensates homeowners in that situation for whom cladding removal isn't enough?
Well, I think the first thing is, were these buildings put up in line with proper building regulations? If they were put up in line with regulation, then I'm afraid the government is culpable. If they weren't put up in line with building regulations, then whoever built the building and the owner of the building is therefore culpable. So we have to get that. But the leaseholders should not be. One of the things that the government has done is to provide a grant to make sure that fire alarms are put in place instead of having these very expensive waking watches.
They are indeed very onerous on lots of homeowners there. Dawn, I want to ask you about a piece in the Sunday Times reporting today that flat sales have actually halved because of dangerous cladding concerns, and it's estimated around 1.5 million people actually live in unmortgageable flats. Are you concerned that this is actually now having a knock-on effect on the housing market?
Well, I mean, I've had constituents write to me very distressed in regards to being unable to sell their property. And some constituents live next to a building that has dangerous cladding applied to it. And at the end of the day, you've really got to put people before profits. It affects everything. It affects, we talked about mental health earlier. It affects people's mental health, the fact that they're living in a fire trap, as Rosie said. And there's no excuse really for the government delaying the changes that needed to be done. There's absolutely no excuse for that. And in Brent, we are the third highest in regards to the number of buildings that have unsafe cladding on there. And that's only because those have been tested. As more are tested, I fear that we will have more buildings in Brent that have unsafe cladding. And I just think we should not be saying it's OK for people to live in dangerous properties.
Bob, Dawn mentions the mental health impact on all of these people, 1.5 million across the country impacted by this. When you're stuck in a home you don't want to be in, it's onerous, isn't it? The impact it can have on you.
Yes, indeed. And I think, this is one of the other things that you've got. Not only have you stuck indoors, but you're stuck indoors in a building that may be unsafe. And I think the reality is that what we've got to do is make sure we understand who owns these buildings. One of the problems we do have is we don't have a proper property register on who is actually responsible for these buildings. And that's probably the first thing that actually has to be reformed, so we get to the stage of knowing who's responsible.
Absolutely. It is an issue that we will, of course, return to again here on the programme.